The thwip of the needle was the only steady sound in the Darrow cabin. It was a small, determined noise, a stitch of order against the larger, unraveling fabric of their lives. Clara Darrow kept her head bowed over the worn cotton of her brother's shirt, her fingers working fast, the calluses on her thumb and forefinger moving with an efficiency that had become automatic. She was 19, but her eyes held the flat, tired look of someone much older. Outside, the Montana wind was a constant shove against the thin glass of the window, carrying the grit of Bitter Creek and the smell of pine and distant snow. The cabin was just 2 rooms, built by her father before the fever took him and her mother, one after the other, leaving Clara alone with Wesley. Clara did the work. She mended, she cooked, she scrubbed the pine boards. She tended the meager garden that the high-altitude chill always tried to kill. Wesley did the drinking. He gambled at the saloon. He rode hard, and he came back smelling of cheap whiskey and resentment, his failures always finding their way to her door. The sound of a horse stopping outside made her needle pause. It was too early for Wesley to be back, and this hoofbeat was heavier, slower. She heard the heavy tread of boots on the porch, followed by a hard, official rap on the door. Wesley was home. She hadn't even heard him come in. He must have been in the small bedroom, sleeping off the night. She heard him curse, the scrape of his chair. Clara stayed in her corner, pretending to be absorbed by a difficult seam. The door opened. "Wesley," a voice said. It was smooth, but with a hard edge underneath, like a polished stone. Silas Croft. He owned the mercantile, the saloon, and, it seemed, most of the debts in Bitter Creek. "Croft," Wesley grumbled. "I told you I'd have it by the first." "The first was last week. Darrow, my patience is not a charitable institution. You owe me $83, and that's not counting the interest on the feed bill." Clara's needle stopped. $83. It was an impossible sum. A fortune. It was more than she could make in a year of taking in mending from the town. "I've got collateral," Wesley said, his voice lowering, trying to sound slick. "Your father's land is worthless, and the cabin is falling down. Your horses are lame." "What collateral?" There was a long, heavy silence. Clara held her breath. She could hear the faint tink of Croft tapping something against his pocket watch. "The girl," Wesley said. Clara's blood went cold. It felt as if the wind outside had punched through the wall and settled in her chest. "What girl?" Croft asked, his voice sharp with new interest. "My sister, Clara." Clara's stomach turned over. She felt a cold sweat on her palms. "She's 19, Wesley said, his voice hurried, like a man trying to sell a horse before the buyer spots the limp. "Healthy, a hard worker. She can cook, clean, sew. She's untouched, worth more than $80. Clara felt dizzy. She squeezed the needle so hard she felt the blunt end press a deep, painful dent into her finger. Untouched. He said it like he was describing a bolt of cloth. "I'm not in that line of business, Darrow," Croft said, but the dismissal sounded thin. "Not for you," Wesley pressed. "But those ranchers you're backing, the ones heading up to the Judith Basin? They're always looking for women to staff the camps, a cook, a laundress, whatever. She's pretty enough. When she's cleaned up, you take her, wipe the debt. You can sell her contract to them for twice that." Sell her contract. The words were a flimsy cover for the truth. He was selling her. "I don't know, Wesley. That's complicated. It borders on paying a debt," Wesley snapped. "Or do you want to wait another 6 months? Look, just come with me to the trading post tomorrow. The bar end men are meeting me there about some horses. They'll see her. They'll take her. You'll have your money, and I'll have a stake from the horses. It's clean." "Tomorrow, at noon," Croft said. His voice was final. "Bring her, and Darrow, make sure she's presentable." The door shut. The heavy boots walked away. Clara sat frozen, the shirt bunched in her lap. The room was silent except for the frantic hammering of her own heart. She heard the glug of a bottle, the scrape of the cork. Wesley walked out of the main room, holding a brown bottle. He looked at her, his eyes cold and assessing. He saw her, but he didn't see her. He saw a solution, an asset. "You heard that," he said. It wasn't a question. She couldn't speak. She just stared at him. The brother who had stolen her mother's silver locket to pay a poker debt. The brother who ate the food she cooked and never said a word of thanks. "You're going to be marrying a man." "Clara," he said, taking a long pull from the bottle. "A group of them. Ranchers. They're moving north." "Marrying?" Her voice was a dry croak. "Wesley, that's not what he said. He said sell." "I'm arranging a match," Wesley said, his face darkening. "It's a good opportunity. You'll be taken care of. You'll have a husband." "You're lying," she whispered, and the quiet words seemed to echo in the small space. "You're trading me, like livestock, for $83. She stood up, the mending falling to the floor. "No, you can't. Father would never." "Father is dead," Wesley snarled, his civility vanishing. "And his debts are mine, which means they're yours. You're a burden. Clara, you've been a burden since the day they died. It's time you earned your keep." "I earn my keep!" Her voice rose, shaking with a terror that was fast turning to desperate anger. "I do everything. This house, the food, the mending. You do nothing but drink and gamble away what little we have left." "You'll be quiet," he warned, stepping toward her. "No, I won't go. You can't make me. I'll go to Sheriff Miller. I'll tell him what you're doing." "Tell him what? That I've arranged a marriage for my sister? That I'm settling my debts? He'll thank me for taking one more mouth off the town's charity list." He was in front of her now, smelling of whiskey and sweat. "You are going to that outpost tomorrow. You are going to look pleasant, and you are going to do exactly as I say. You are my blood, and you answer to me." "I am not property. Wesley." The words were barely out of her mouth before his hand cracked across her face. It was not a shove. It was a full, open-palmed slap that snapped her head to the side and sent a blinding, white-hot pain through her cheek. The sound of it was sharp, ugly. She stumbled back, crashing against the sewing chair, her hand flying to her face. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and stinging, born of shock and pain and a deep, bottomless humiliation. Her ear rang. She could taste the metallic tang of blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. Wesley stood over her, breathing hard, his hand still raised slightly. He looked at the red mark already blooming on her pale skin, and his expression wasn't regret. It was a cold, flat finality. The last thread of their shared blood, their shared childhood, had just snapped. "You'll be ready at dawn," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you'll wear your mother's blue dress, the one that makes you look less like a stray." He turned, grabbed his hat, and slammed the door, leaving her alone with the ringing in her ears and the absolute certainty that her life was over. The horse-trading outpost was nothing more than a few leaning corrals and a sagging barn, set in a dry, wind-scoured hollow miles from Bitter Creek. It was a place for men to make deals they didn't want the law to see. The air was thick with the smell of horse manure, dust, and the sour smoke of a badly tended fire. Wesley's hand was clamped around her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like a vice. He had tied her hands in front of her with a short length of rope. "So you don't try running," he'd said, as if there was anywhere to run. He dragged her from his horse and shoved her toward a group of 5 men huddled near a corral. They were the men from the Bar Inn. They were rough, their faces burned by sun and wind, their clothes stiff with dirt. They stopped talking as Wesley approached, their eyes landing on Clara and sticking there. She was wearing the blue dress. It was too thin for the biting wind, and she trembled, from cold, from terror. "This is her," Wesley said, his voice falsely hearty. He gave her a shake. "My sister, Clara." One of the men, a big man with a greasy beard and small, piggish eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She's a bit skinny. Darrow." "She's strong," Wesley said quickly. "A hard worker. She can cook for your whole outfit." "Can she do more than cook?" Another man snickered, and the others laughed. Clara's face burned. She stared at the ground, at the scuffed toes of her boots, willing herself to disappear. This was not a marriage arrangement. This was an auction. She was the livestock. "She's 19, like I told Croft," Wesley said. "And quiet. You won't get any trouble from her." The big man, Jed, stepped forward. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her feel stripped bare. "Let's see her teeth," Jed said. Wesley grabbed Clara's chin and tried to force her head up. She resisted, clamping her jaw shut, a small, choked sound of protest dying in her throat. "She's shy," Wesley grunted, his fingers digging into the fresh bruise on her cheek. "I don't mind shy," Jed said, and he reached out a grimy hand, his thumb aiming for the corner of her mouth. "But I like to see the merchandise." Clara flinched violently, pulling back, but Wesley's grip held her fast. She was trapped between her brother's cruelty and the stranger's looming violation. The man's hand was inches from her face, thick fingers calloused and black with dirt. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Not while I breathe." The voice was low, cold, and cut through the men's laughter like a razor. It came from behind them. Clara's eyes snapped open. The man, Jed, froze, his hand hovering in the air. All the men turned. A man was standing near the edge of the corral, not 10 yards away. He must have ridden in without them noticing. He was lean, dressed in a battered canvas coat and worn leggings. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that was all harsh angles and sun-scorched skin. A pale scar ran from his temple down to his jaw, pulling at the corner of one eye, giving him a permanent, watchful squint. He wasn't looking at the men. He was looking at Wesley's hand on Clara's arm and the rope binding her wrists. He was just a lone cowboy, his horse a rangy bay tied to the rail, but there was a stillness to him that was more dangerous than any threat. Jed slowly lowered his hand, his eyes narrowing. "This ain't your concern, friend." "You put your hand on her," the stranger said, his voice flat. "It becomes my concern." Wesley, bolstered by the 5 ranchers, puffed up his chest. "This is a family matter. My sister, I'm arranging her future." The stranger's gaze shifted to Wesley. His eyes were a cold, clear gray, and they missed nothing. They saw the bruise on Clara's cheek, the terror in her eyes, the rope. "You call this an arrangement?" the stranger said, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, to rest on the worn wooden grip of the revolver holstered at his hip. "I call it something else." Jed bristled. "Who the hell are you to say? It's 5 of us. One of you." The stranger didn't answer. He took one slow step forward. Clara watched him, her heart pounding a new, strange rhythm. He wasn't looking at her like the others. He wasn't looking at her as a woman, or as property. He was looking at her like a man looking at a trap he was about to spring. "Go on, Jed," one of the other men egged him on. "Touch her. Let's see what this lone wolf does." Jed smiled, a cruel, broken-toothed expression. He looked back at Clara. "I believe I will." He lunged, his hand grabbing for her shoulder. It happened faster than Clara could track. The stranger moved. He didn't draw his gun. He crossed the space in 2 long strides. There was the sharp, solid thud of bone hitting flesh. The stranger's fist connected with Jed's jaw. A brutal, efficient punch that snapped the big man's head back. Jed crumpled, landing hard in the dirt and manure, out cold. The other 4 men scrambled, cursing, reaching for their own weapons. But the stranger's gun was already out. The click of the hammer being pulled back was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. He didn't point it at any one man. He held it low, steady, his cold gray eyes moving over all of them. "She's not for sale," he said. "Now, see here," Wesley sputtered, his courage failing fast. "You can't just—" The stranger turned on Wesley. Before her brother could finish the sentence, the cowboy hit him. 2. It wasn't a quick punch like the one for Jed. It was a hard, driving blow to the gut that folded Wesley in half, making him gasp and drop Clara's arm. The stranger followed it with a backhand across Wesley's face that sent him stumbling to his knees. Then, silence. The 4 ranchers stood frozen, their hands halfway to their guns. Wesley was on the ground, spitting blood. Jed was unconscious. The stranger looked at Clara. His face was hard, unreadable. He holstered his revolver. In 2 steps, he was in front of her. He didn't speak. He pulled a knife from his belt, and with one swift, clean motion, he cut the rope binding her wrists. The fibers fell away. He grabbed her arm. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel. It was urgent. "Come on." He didn't wait for an answer. He hauled her toward his horse, half pulling, half carrying her. She stumbled, her legs numb, her mind reeling. He threw a leg over the saddle and, with one powerful arm around her waist, lifted her up, settling her sideways in front of him. "Hey!" one of the ranchers shouted, finally finding his nerve. "That's Darrow's property!" A gunshot cracked the air. A bullet whined past Clara's ear, so close she felt the heat of it. The stranger cursed, dug his heels into the bay's flanks, and wrapped his free arm tight around her waist, shielding her body with his own. The horse leaped forward, surging from a standstill into a dead run. More shots rang out. They echoed off the rocky hollow as they cleared the outpost, thundering up the narrow trail that led into the high pines. The stranger leaned low over the horse's neck, pulling Clara down with him. She clung to the saddle horn with one hand and his coat with the other, her face pressed against the rough, dusty canvas. All she could hear was the pounding of the hooves, the horse's strained breathing, and the wind screaming in her ears. They rode for what felt like hours. Long after the shouting and the gunshots had faded, they pushed the horse hard, up steep, rocky inclines, through dense thickets of pine and aspen that scraped at their legs, and across a shallow, fast-moving creek that soaked her dress to the knee. The man, Eli McCall, though she didn't know his name, seemed to know every trail. He moved with a grim purpose, his arm a solid, unyielding bar of iron around her waist. He didn't slow until they were deep in the forest, in a small clearing shielded by a ring of towering lodgepole pines. The sun was already beginning to dip, and the air in the high country was sharp and cold. He swung off the horse first, his movement stiff. Then he reached up for her. "Easy," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken directly to her. His hands on her waist were large and firm. He lowered her to the ground. Her legs gave out instantly, trembling too hard to hold her. She would have collapsed if he hadn't caught her. He held her steady for a moment, then let her sink to the ground on a bed of dry pine needles. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. The terror of the outpost had been replaced by a cold, numb shock. She was free of Wesley, but she was in the middle of the Montana wilderness, with a man who had, in the space of 5 minutes, knocked out 2 men and stolen her. He didn't speak to her. He didn't crowd her. He gave her space, moving with a quiet competence. He unsaddled the bay, rubbed it down with a handful of dry grass, and tethered it where it could graze. He unstrapped a bedroll and a small sack from the saddle. From the sack, he pulled a small hatchet and began methodically stripping dry branches from the lower limbs of a dead pine. Within minutes, he had a small, neat fire crackling. The warmth felt impossible. He opened his bedroll, pulled out a thick wool blanket, and walked over to her. He didn't try to touch her. He just held it out. Clara looked up at him, His face was stark in the firelight. The scar was livid. His gray eyes were watchful, guarded. She took the blanket, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grip it. "Thank you," she whispered. Her throat was raw. He nodded once. He went back to his sack, pulling out a strip of dried beef and a hard biscuit. He offered them to her. She took them, though she had no appetite. She knew she had to eat. He sat on the other side of the fire, a respectful distance away, and ate his own small portion. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind through the high branches. Clara stared into the fire, the wool blanket clutched around her shoulders. She was still wearing her mother's blue dress, now stained with creek water and horse sweat. She was alive. She was cold. She was terrified. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice cracking. Eli McCall didn't look up from the fire immediately. He finished chewing his biscuit, took a swallow from his canteen. "Why'd you do that?" she asked again, stronger this time. He looked at her then. His gaze was direct, unsettling. "No woman deserves to be sold." It was so simple. It wasn't heroic. It was just a fact, stated like he was talking about the weather. "Those men, Wesley, they'll come after you. They'll come after us." "They'll try," he said. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask her what happened. He didn't ask if Wesley was really her brother. He just sat there, feeding small sticks into the fire, creating a small circle of light in the vast, gathering dark. The silence stretched, but it wasn't like the silence in the cabin with Wesley. This silence was empty. It had space. Clara found herself talking, the words spilling out in a low, trembling rush, as if the slap had broken something open inside her. "His name is Wesley. He is my brother. Our parents. They died 2 years ago. The fever. He gambles. He drinks. He owed Mr. Croft $83. She didn't look at him as she spoke, just at the dancing flames. "He told me he was arranging a marriage, but I heard him tell Mr. Croft to sell my contract. He called me collateral. He hit me last night when I said I wouldn't go." She touched her cheek. The skin was tender, swollen. "I've been mending shirts and dresses for almost everyone in Bitter Creek just to buy flour. He took the money. He always took the money." She finally stopped, a dry sob catching in her throat. She looked at this stranger, this scarred, quiet man. "No one," she whispered, the admission tearing at her. "No one has been gentle with me since my mother died." Eli McCall watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer pity. He simply listened, his presence a solid, unmoving thing in the night. When she was finished, he said nothing for a long time. He just poked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up into the blackness. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "My name is Eli McCall. You're safe for tonight, Clara." He knew her name. She had said it, telling her story. He laid his bedroll out between her and the direction of the trail. He kept his gun belt on. "Get some sleep. We move at first light." Clara huddled under the wool blanket, her back against the trunk of a pine. She watched him lie down on his bedroll, his hat tilted over his eyes, one arm bent under his head. He was asleep, or pretending to be, in minutes. She was not. She stared into the embers, her mind replaying the sight of Jed's hand, the sound of Eli's voice, the crack of the gun. The Montana wilderness stretched out around them, vast and cold and full of wolves. They were alone, and they were hunted. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she was more afraid of what was behind her or what lay ahead. Clara woke to a world gone silent and white. It was the cold that woke her, a deep, penetrating chill that had worked its way through the wool blanket. She sat up, her body aching, and saw Eli McCall already standing, looking out the small gap in the pines. It was snowing. Not a gentle flurry, but a thick, determined fall of heavy, wet flakes. The fire was a circle of hissing embers. Their tracks from the day before were already vanishing. "It covers the trail," she said, her voice a small, hopeful croak. Eli turned, his face grim in the gray dawn light. He pulled his hat lower. "It covers ours, and it covers theirs, but it makes travel slow, and this cold will kill you in that dress." He was already kicking snow onto the last of the embers, scattering the ashes. There was no discussion. His urgency was a physical thing, sharp as the wind. "We move," he said. He saddled the bay, his movements quick and economical. He handed her the last of the jerky. She chewed the tough, salty meat while shoving the blanket under her dress, wrapping it around her waist and legs for a clumsy, bulky warmth. It was a poor solution, but it was all they had. He lifted her onto the horse, then swung up behind her, his body a solid wall against the wind. The snow was already 6 inches deep, and the horse labored, its breath pluming in the frigid air. They rode deeper into the forest, climbing. Eli guided the horse not on any visible path, but through a landscape he seemed to read by instinct. He wove through dense stands of pine, followed the invisible lines of ridges, and crossed frozen creeks that cracked and groaned under the horse's weight. Clara had never felt so cold. The wet snow soaked the thin cotton of her dress, clinging to her shoulders and hair. Her feet, in their worn leather boots, had lost all feeling hours ago. She huddled against him, her head tucked against his chest, trying to steal some of his warmth. He was a solid block of heat. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart under his canvas coat. She lost all track of time. There was only the white, swirling curtain of the snow, the rhythmic plodding of the horse, and the ache in her bones. She must have dozed. Her body slumped against him, because she was startled when the horse stopped. "We're here," Eli's voice rumbled against her ear. She looked up. Through the blinding snow, she saw a dark shape, a small, low structure half buried in a drift. It was a cabin, barely more than a shed, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud. A thin tendril of old, dead smoke was frozen to the stone chimney. He slid off the horse and reached for her. She had no strength to help. Her legs were numb, useless. He simply lifted her, his arms strong, and carried her the last few yards, kicking the snow-drifted door open with his boot. He set her down inside. The air was still, heavy with the smell of cured pelts, old smoke and animal musk. It was dark, the single window covered with a stretched piece of oiled parchment, but it was out of the wind. Eli went back out, leading the horse into a small, 3-sided lean-to attached to the cabin. Clara heard him stamping and moving. Then he was back, his shoulders covered in snow. He shut the heavy plank door and dropped the thick wooden bar into place. The silence that fell was absolute. There was no wind, just the sound of their breathing. "A trapper's line cabin," he said, his voice quiet in the small space. "He won't be back till spring thaw, if he comes back at all." He moved with purpose, finding a stack of dry wood and kindling left by the hearth. He used his flint and steel, and in minutes, a small, hungry fire was catching. The light flickered, illuminating the small, one-room space. There was a crude bunk covered in furs, a small table, and a few traps hanging on the wall. Clara huddled near the growing flames, her body seized by a violent, racking shiver she couldn't control. Eli unbarred the door, stepped out, and came back with his saddlebag and the bedroll, both covered in snow. He brushed them off, then opened the bag. He pulled out a small tin of salve and a clean rag. He knelt in front of her. "Your face," he said. She had forgotten the bruise. The cold had numbed it. She looked at him, confused. He uncorked his canteen, poured a little water onto the rag, and reached toward her. Clara flinched. It was involuntary, a sharp, violent recoil that pulled her whole upper body back. Her hand flew up to block him, her eyes wide with a sudden, stupid panic. Eli froze. His hand stopped, inches from her face. His gray eyes, lit by the fire, held no anger. They just watched. He saw the movement for what it was. Not a rejection of him, but a reaction to the past. He stayed perfectly still, his hand outstretched, waiting. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low and rough. She stared at his hand. It was scarred, the knuckles calloused, the fingers thick. It was the hand that had struck Wesley. It was the hand that had held a gun on 5 men. Slowly, fighting every instinct in her body, she lowered her own hand. He moved with painstaking slowness. He touched the rag to her cheek. It was cool. He wiped away the small traces of dried blood and grime. His touch was so light it was barely there. He was just cleaning the wound. Then he dipped his fingers into the small tin of salve and gently, so gently, spread it over the swollen, tender skin. His fingers were rough, but his touch was a whisper. A single tear tracked down Clara's other cheek. It had nothing to do with the pain of the bruise. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until he pulled his hand away. He looked at the floor, corked the canteen, and put the salve away. "I haven't," she whispered, her voice thick. He looked up. "I haven't been touched gently," she said, the words costing her. "Since my mother died." Eli's face tightened. She saw something move in his eyes. A darkness, a memory. He looked like a man who understood grief, who lived with it. He didn't offer a kind word. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He reached for the iron poker and jabbed at the fire, breaking up a log and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He stared into the flames, his jaw set. The silence was his only reply. The storm settled in. For 2 days, the wind howled and the snow piled up against the door. They were trapped. The small cabin became their world. They ate the trappers' meager stores, some dried beans, a little coffee. Eli ventured out only to feed and water the bay, coming back each time caked in ice. The forced stillness, the quiet, began to wear away their defenses. Clara found her voice first. She talked about her mother, about the small joys of her life before. And then, haltingly, she told him her dream. "I always wanted to be a teacher," she said, staring at the furs on the bunk. "I only had 6 years of schooling, but I loved it. I loved the feel of the chalk. I loved the idea that a word on a slate could be a door. I used to dream of having my own schoolhouse, a real one, with glass windows. I'd teach any child who wanted to learn, reading, numbers. It seems foolish now." "It's not foolish," Eli said. He was sitting on the floor, cleaning his revolver, the pieces laid out on a cloth. "A schoolhouse, that's a fine thing to build." "What about you, Eli?" she asked, bolder now. "Where were you riding before you found me?" He stopped his work, his hands still. "Nowhere, just moving." "You're always moving?" "It's safer. What are you running from?" He looked up, his gray eyes pinning her. She thought he wouldn't answer. He carefully began reassembling the gun, his movements precise. "The war," he said finally. "And what came after?" "The war between the states?" "I fought for the Union, in Missouri. It wasn't clean. It was border fighting. Bushwhackers and jayhawkers. Neighbors killing neighbors. It wasn't war, it was just mean." He tested the cylinder, spinning it. "When I got back, things were different. I was different. There was a woman, Sarah." He said the name like it was a stone in his mouth. "I thought I was going to marry her. I'd built a small ranch. I'd saved my pay. While I was gone, she took up with a quartermaster, a man who sold rotten beef to the army and got rich doing it. When I returned, they were living in my house. He'd filed a claim on my land. Said I was dead. She testified for him. Said she'd seen my grave." Clara's hand went to her mouth. "Eli." He had money. He had power. I had nothing but this. He tapped the revolver. She told me I was a ghost, that the man she knew never came back from the fighting. She was probably right. What did you do? I left, rode west. I've been riding west ever since. He slid the gun into its holster. Some things can't be fixed. Clara, they can only be left behind. He didn't look at her. He stood and checked the bar on the door, though he knew it was solid. He had shared his wound, and now he needed to be alone with it. Clara watched him, her heart aching with a new, different kind of pain. He was as broken as she was. That night, the cold was a living thing. The storm was at its peak, the wind screaming over the roof, rattling the door in its frame. The fire was their only defense. But the cabin walls leaked cold. Eli laid the trapper's furs and their 2 blankets on the floor near the hearth, creating one small nest of warmth. You take the bed, he said. It's too cold, she said, her teeth chattering. The fire. We'll both freeze if we're that far from it. He hesitated. He knew she was right. He lay down first, his back to the fire, his gun belt still on. He left a wide, respectful space for her. Clara lay down on the other side, facing him, pulling a fur up to her chin. The space between them felt a mile wide and colder than the snow. They lay in silence for a long time, listening to the wind. She couldn't stop shaking. It was a deep, uncontrollable shiver that vibrated through her bones. After an hour, she couldn't stand it. Hesitantly, trembling, she moved. She shifted across the small space, her knee bumping his. He didn't move. She turned onto her side and curled against his back, pressing her cold face between his shoulder blades, tucking her hands against his stomach. He went rigid. He felt like he was carved from stone. Eli, she whispered, her breath fogging against his shirt. He let out a long, slow breath. Then, slowly, he turned over. Now they were facing each other, nested in the furs, so close their breath mingled. The firelight played over his scarred, hard face. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, aching conflict. You're cold, he stated. Yes, but it was a lie. Her shiver wasn't just from the cold anymore. She was terrified, but not of him. She was terrified of the strange, powerful pull she felt, the deep, animal need for warmth, for contact, for life. Slowly, she lifted a hand, her fingers still numb. She touched his chest, over the rough canvas of his coat. She felt the solid muscle beneath. He didn't move. Emboldened, she slipped her hand beneath the coat, laying her palm flat against his shirt. She felt the hard ridge of a scar through the cotton. She felt his heart, beating hard and fast against her hand. He trembled. It was a tremor that ran through his whole body, a deep shudder. He closed his eyes, his face tight with a pain she didn't understand. The wind howled, a desperate, lonely sound. The desire in the small cabin was as loud as the storm. It was the ache of 2 lonely people, 2 broken halves, wanting to be whole. He opened his eyes. They were dark with a hunger that frightened and thrilled her. He lifted his hand, the one that had been so gentle, and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. This was her choice. This was her choice. He leaned in, his mouth hovering just above hers. She could feel the heat of his breath. And then he stopped. He pulled back, his hand dropping from her face. He rolled onto his back, staring at the dark ceiling. Not like this, he whispered. His voice choked. Clara's eyes opened, confusion clouding her mind. What? Not like this, he repeated, firmer. Not when you've been hurt, not when you're scared and cold, and depending on me for your life. I won't be another man who takes something from you. The words hit her like a slap, colder than the wind, sharper than Wesley's hand. He thought he was being noble. He thought he was protecting her. He was rejecting her. He was taking her choice away. A hot, bitter anger flared in her chest, a sudden inferno that burned away the cold and the fear. "I'm not a child. Eli—" Her voice was low, shaking with a sudden, new strength. "I'm not a piece of glass. Do you think I don't know what I want?" She scrambled to her feet, the furs falling away. The cold of the cabin hit her instantly. "Clara, stop." "No, you don't get to decide for me. Wesley decided for me. Those men decided for me. You will not be another one. You think I'm weak. You think I'm broken." "That's not what I think," he said, sitting up, his face desperate in the firelight. "Isn't it? You look at me, and you see a victim, someone to be saved." She was breathing hard, the words tearing out of her. "I am not your ghost. Eli, I am not Sarah. I am here." She couldn't be in that room. She couldn't breathe, blinded by tears of rage and humiliation. She turned, lifted the heavy bar on the door, and threw it open. The storm hit her like a physical blow, a wall of wind and ice particles that stole her breath. "Clara!" Eli shouted. She ran out into the blinding white darkness, wearing nothing but her thin cotton dress and her mother's boots. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran, stumbling through the deep drifts, the snow burning her skin, the wind screaming in her ears. She didn't get far, maybe 30 yards. The snow was waist deep, a heavy, sucking trap. She fell, crashing into the snow-laden branches of a pine tree, and crumpled at its base. And then the anger was gone, as fast as it had come. It left her empty, hollow. There was only the cold, and the dark, and the crushing, bottomless weight of her grief. She was alone. She was going to die. She leaned her head against the rough bark of the tree and sobbed. They were not angry tears. They were the sobs of a lost child, a broken woman, a person who had nothing left. She heard him call her name, a desperate roar against the wind. A moment later, he was there. He crashed through the snow, his face a mask of panic. He saw her, huddled at the base of the tree, shaking, covered in snow. He didn't speak. He didn't scold her. He didn't say, "I told you so." He reached down and, in one powerful, desperate movement, he scooped her up into his arms. He held her tight against his chest, her face pressed into the warmth of his neck, and turned his back to the wind. He carried her back to the cabin, kicking the door shut against the storm. He didn't let her go. He carried her straight to the nest of furs and sat down, pulling her into his lap, wrapping all the blankets and furs around both of them. He just held her. He held her as she wept, her body shaking apart. He held her with a fierce, protective strength that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with comfort. He rocked her gently, his hand stroking her snow-matted hair, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've got you. Just be still. You're safe. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're safe." He held her through the long, dark hours, long after the sobs had weakened, long after her shivers had quieted. He held her as her exhaustion finally claimed her, and her breathing evened out in sleep. He didn't sleep. He just sat by the fire, holding her, watching the flames, his face a study of a man at war with himself. When Clara woke, the storm had passed. Pale, watery sunlight was streaming through the oiled parchment window. The cabin was quiet. She was tucked into the furs. Alone, the fire was built up, crackling brightly. Eli was sitting at the small table, his back to her, drinking coffee from a tin cup. She sat up, her body stiff and sore, but warm. She was wearing his canvas coat. He must have put it on her while she slept. It was huge, smelling of him, of leather, smoke, and pine. She felt a hot blush of shame creep up her neck. "Eli?" she said, her voice shy. He turned. His face was tired. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, but his eyes were clear, and the conflict in them was gone. I'm sorry," she whispered, looking down at her hands.
For running, for all of it."
"No," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm the one who's sorry. You were right. I was trying to protect you, and I hurt you. I won't do that again." He poured coffee into the other tin cup and held it out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. This time, she didn't flinch. They ate breakfast, the last of the beans, in a new, companionable silence. As the sun rose higher, a sound broke the stillness, a long, mournful cry, answered by another. "Wolves, close." Clara looked up, startled. Eli was already on his feet, moving to the door. He unbarred it, cracking it open just enough to look out. He scanned the bright, snow-covered forest, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. His body was tense, wary, his gaze sharp. He was a part of the wild, just like the creatures calling from the trees. The moment of peace was over. Miles away, in the mud-soaked street of Bitter Creek, Wesley Darrow pushed open the doors of the Red Dog Saloon. His face was a ruin. His lip was split, his eyes swollen shut, and his gut ached from Eli's punch. Humiliation burned hotter than the whiskey in his belly. He strode to the back table, where two men sat playing cards. They were not locals. They were Skinners, men who had drifted down from the north, their reputation preceding them. One was a tall, skeletal man named Shaw, who wore a long duster despite the warmth of the saloon. The other was a stocky, half-Comanche man named Red, who had a knife scar that ran from his ear to his chin. They killed for money. Wesley threw a small, clinking bag onto the table. It wasn't much. It was the last of his father's money. "I want my sister back," Wesley snarled. She was taken by a man named McCall, a drifter with a scar on his face. Shaw didn't look up from his cards. "Property disputes are messy. She's not a dispute. She's mine. And he assaulted me. He stole my horse." Red looked up, his black eyes flat and empty. And I want him dead," Wesley hissed, the words raw. "I want him shot, and I want her brought back. I don't care what condition she's in." He pushed the bag forward. "That's half. You'll get the other half when I have her." Shaw finally looked at Wesley, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. He picked up the bag, weighed it in his hand, and nodded at Red. "Find the man," Wesley said, his voice shaking with hate. "Bring her back, alive or dead. I don't care, just as long as he's in the ground." It took them 3 days to walk out of the high country. The snow held, a blinding white sheet that hid their trail but tried to claim their lives. Eli led the way, his big bay horse heavy laden with their few supplies, breaking a path for Clara. He had wrapped her feet in strips torn from his spare blanket, but she was still half frozen, moving in a daze of cold and exhaustion. They came out of the pines into a lower valley where the snow had turned to a gray, slushy mud. In the distance, a column of wood smoke smudged the sky. "Town," Eli said. His voice was raw from the cold. It was a place called Cutler's Gap, a raw, rough settlement huddled in a valley. It lived for one thing: the giant, screaming circular saw in the mill at the end of the main street. The entire town smelled of sawdust and wet pine. They needed a room. They needed food. Eli had a few dollars left, folded in a piece of oilcloth in his pocket. He found a sign, "Room to Let," hanging above a small bakery. The air coming from the chimney was a miracle. It smelled of yeast and warm bread. A woman with flour on her apron and hard, suspicious eyes met them at the back door. Her name was Hatcher. "We need a room," Eli said. He stood slightly in front of Clara, shielding her from the woman's gaze. "My wife and I, we had trouble on the trail. Lost our wagon." The woman's eyes flicked to Clara, taking in the ruined blue dress, the man's coat she was drowning in, and the dark, ugly bruise on her cheek. She saw the way Eli's hand rested near the butt of his revolver. "Wife, you say?" Mrs. Hatcher said, It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Clara stepped out from behind him. Her voice was small but clear.
I am Mrs. McCall. We need a place. We can pay.
The lie, saying the name, sent a strange jolt through her. It felt heavy and false in her mouth.
Mrs.
Hatcher stared at her for a long second, then sighed. She was a practical woman, and winter was hard. $4 for the week, in advance. And I'll need another $1 for a key. You bring it to the saloon. You forfeit the room. No loud noises. My husband bakes at 4 in the morning. Eli paid her. The room was small, tucked under the eaves. It had a sloping ceiling, a narrow iron bedstead, and a single washstand with a chipped porcelain bowl. But it was warm. The heat from the ovens below radiated through the floorboards, and the smell of fresh bread was thick in the air. To Clara, after the ice and the wind, it felt like a palace. She sat on the bed, her hands still shaking, and breathed in the smell of home. "Get some rest," Eli said. He handed her the last of his money, all but a few cents. "Tomorrow, buy a dress, something warm, and thread, and food. I'll find work at the mill." Clara slept for 12 hours, a deep, exhausted sleep, tucked under the thin quilt, safe for the first time. The next day, she ventured out. Eli had already left, his boots echoing on the stairs before dawn. Clara walked into Slocum's Mercantile, her chin held high, though her insides were trembling. The store went quiet when she entered. 3 women, gathered by the boat cloth, stopped talking. They looked at her. They looked at her bruised face, her strange, oversized man's coat, and they turned their backs. The whispers followed her as she moved to the counter. "That's the one. Came in late last night with that gunman."
Look at her face.
"He must have given her that. I heard from a teamster up from Bitter Creek that she's the one, the Darrow girl, sold by her brother. My goodness, sold. Like cattle. And this one, he just took her." Clara's face burned hot. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide in the warm room and never come out. She thought of the cold, of Wesley's hand, of the man Jed's greedy fingers. She thought of Eli, his voice flat and cold. "Not while I breathe." She stood up straight. She would not let them break her. She pointed to a bolt of dark green wool, serviceable and strong. 6 yards of that, please," she said to Mr. Slocum, her voice steady. "And a spool of white thread, needles, and 10 pounds of flour." The shopkeeper, his eyes curious, measured the cloth. She paid in cash, her hand steady, and met his gaze without flinching. She gathered her packages and walked out, the wall of silence and whispers parting for her as she went. She was the sold girl. She was the gunman's ruined woman. She spent the next 2 days in the room, her needle flying. She made herself a proper dress, solid and respectable. She mended Eli's coat, and as she stitched, the simple, familiar work began to stitch her own mind back together. Eli found work at the sawmill. It was brutal, dangerous labor, hauling massive, dripping logs from the river and stacking the fresh-cut planks. The air was a constant scream of metal on wood, thick with sawdust that coated his clothes and filled his lungs. The other men were rough-hewn, suspicious of the newcomer with the scarred face and the gun he never took off. They had all heard the rumors about his wife. On the 3rd day, Taggart, a big man with a mouth that always ran, cornered Eli by the scrap pile. "You're that McCall, ain't you?" Taggart said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco. "The one with the little stray you picked up." Eli didn't stop his work. He just looked at him. "That's my wife you're talking about." "Wife?" Taggart laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I heard she was common property down Bitter Creek way. Heard her brother couldn't give her away, so you just took her. Tell me, McCall, does she—" Taggart never finished. Eli moved so fast he seemed a blur. He dropped the plank he was holding and hit Taggart once. It was a hard, clean, devastating punch to the jaw. The sound of it, a wet, solid crack, was audible even over the whine of the saw. Taggart dropped like a sack of grain and didn't move. The other men froze. The silence that fell in the yard was heavy. Eli stood over Taggart, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. The mill foreman came running, followed by the town sheriff, a tired-looking man named Brody. Brody looked at Taggart on the ground, then at Eli's bleeding hand, then at his face. He'd seen men like Eli McCall 100 times. "He insulted my wife," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "He has a big mouth," Brody said, nudging Taggart with his boot. "But in Cutler's Gap, we don't settle insults with our fists, not when those fists are attached to a man wearing a gun like yours." He got what he earned. Maybe so. Brody's eyes were cold. But here's the lesson for today. Men like you're tinder, and this town is dry wood. You don't stay long. You're built for moving, not for settling. You move on before you burn us all down. You understand me. McCall? Eli stared at the sheriff. He saw the truth in the man's eyes. He was marked. I understand. He collected his pay from the foreman, who was only too happy to see him go, and walked back to the bakery. Clara had a stew bubbling on the small pot-bellied stove she'd bought with the last of her sewing money. She had saved their meal, waiting for him. The room felt like a home. She looked up when he came in, a smile on her face. The smile died when she saw his expression. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight. She saw his bleeding hand. "Eli, you're hurt." He sat on the edge of the bed, his body rigid with a contained, cold fury. "A man at the mill, he said things about you." Clara's heart sank. "The rumors." "I hit him." She knelt in front of him, taking his large, battered hand in hers. She went to the washstand, poured water from the pitcher, and began to gently clean the blood from his split knuckles. Her touch was as light as it had been in the trapper's cabin, but this time it was not he tending her. "The sheriff came," he said, his voice rough. "He told me to leave town." He looked away from her, at the small, sloped wall. "We have to go. Clara, in the morning." She finished cleaning the wound, her mind racing. Leave. Go back out into the cold. Be hunted again. The warmth of the room, the smell of the bread, the solid floor beneath her feet. It all felt like it was dissolving. He was packing. He who had faced down 5 men for her. He who had held her while she sobbed. He was packing because his own anger, his own honor, had made them outcasts again. She stood up. He had his back to her, folding his blanket. "No," she said. He stopped, but didn't turn. "Clara, we can't stay. I made trouble. They'll be watching me now. The next man who mouths off, the sheriff will arrest me. Or worse." "I don't care." She walked around to face him. He looked lost, angry, and ashamed. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the old, white scar. "You defended me. No one has ever done that. You hit a man because he spoke ill of me." He had it coming. "I know." Her voice was low, but it didn't tremble. "In the trapper's cabin, you said no. You said you wouldn't take anything from me. You thought you were protecting me, but you were just deciding for me. Like Wesley did." "Clara, that's not—" "Let me finish." She kept her hand on his cheek. "You are a good man. Eli McCall, you are the only good man I have ever known, but you are not my keeper. And I am not your burden. I am not a ghost. I am not a sold girl." She looked him square in the eye. "I want it to be my choice." His breath hitched. He knew what she was saying. This was not the desperate, cold girl in the cabin. This was the woman who had faced down a store full of whispering gossips. This was the woman who had made this small, cold room a home. "Eli," she whispered, her voice breaking just a little. "I want it to be my choice.
Not something taken, not something traded, and not something you refuse me because you think I'm too weak to know my own mind. I want this. I want you. It is my choice."
He searched her face, his gray eyes dark with 1,000 conflicts. He saw no fear. He saw no desperation. He saw her. He saw Clara.
"Are you sure?"
His voice was a raw whisper. She didn't answer. She rose up on her toes, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. It was a clumsy kiss at first, soft and hesitant. It was the first real kiss of her life. He was frozen for a second, stunned. Then, with a low groan that seemed torn from his soul, his arms came around her, pulling her so tight against him she could barely breathe. The kiss changed. It became urgent, hungry. It was the release of all the cold, all the fear, all the desperate loneliness they had both carried for years. It was the fire in the cabin, finally allowed to burn. He was gentle, but his gentleness was a mask for a power that terrified and thrilled her. He picked her up as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the narrow bed. He made love to her slowly, with a reverence that almost broke her heart. His hands, so calloused and scarred, were agonizingly tender. He touched her face, her hair, her shoulders, as if he were memorizing her. He was the one who was trembling. Clara trembled with every kiss, every new touch. A lifetime of hurt and fear had taught her that a man's touch was a prelude to pain. But this was not pain. This was something else. This was a slow, warm unfolding. This was choice. When he finally moved inside her, she cried out, a small, sharp sound. He froze instantly, his face a mask of fear.
"I hurt you?"
"No," she whispered, her fingers digging into his shoulders.
"No, don't stop. Please, Eli, don't stop."
And he didn't. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilt, the only sound in the room their breathing and the distant, cold wind. Clara was crying, silent tears that ran into her hair. He held her, panicked.
"Clara, I'm sorry."
She turned in his arms, pressing her wet face against his chest. She sobbed, a deep, shuddering release that shook her whole body. But it was not a sob of pain. It was the sound of a lock, rusted shut for years, finally breaking open.
I'm not broken."
She wept into his skin. "No," he whispered, his voice thick, his arms a steel cage around her. "No, you're not. You're whole. You're whole." He held her until she cried herself to sleep. In the morning, the light was different. Eli woke first. He watched her sleep, her face peaceful. The bruise on her cheek faded to a pale yellow. She looked younger. He lay there, stunned. He had never felt this. The woman who betrayed him had made him feel cheap. The war had made him feel dead. This woman, this souled girl he had stolen, made him feel human. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him watching her. She didn't look away. She didn't hide. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. It was the first true smile he had ever seen from her. It lit her from the inside, transforming her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He was stunned by it. He had known she was pretty. He had not known she was beautiful. He realized, in that moment, that he would kill any man who tried to take that smile from her. "We're not leaving," he said, his voice rough. Her smile widened. "Good. I'm going to ask Mrs. Hatcher for a job." And she did. She went downstairs, her head high, and offered to scrub floors and knead dough. Mrs. Hatcher, seeing the change in the girl, the way she stood, the new light in her eye, the fading of the bruise, gave a short, sharp nod. "Be here at 5 in the morning. You'll be paid in bread and board, and 50 cents a week." A new life began. It was a fragile, hesitant thing. Eli went back to the mill. The sheriff watched him. Taggart and his friends avoided him. But the foreman, needing every hand, let him stay. Clara worked in the bakery. She came back to their room every afternoon covered in flour, her hands raw from lye soap, but her eyes bright. They built a life in that small, warm room. Their evenings were quiet. They would sit at the small table, the smell of tomorrow's bread baking below them. Eli would clean his tack or sharpen his knife. Clara would read to him from an old newspaper she'd found, her voice growing stronger and more confident. One night, she read a funny story about a politician in Helena, and she laughed. It was a real, light, silvery sound. Eli stopped what he was doing, his heart seizing. He had never heard her laugh. He reached across the table and took her hand. His calloused thumb rubbed the flour from her knuckles. She laced her fingers with his. They sat like that for an hour, in the warm, bread-scented dark, saying nothing at all. It was a hesitant joy, but it was real. It lasted for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of peace, 2 weeks of work, 2 weeks of falling in love. Eli was walking back from the mill, his pay in his pocket. He was thinking of buying Clara a new ribbon, a blue one. He was halfway down the main street when a rider came into town. The man was not a logger. He was not a rancher. He was tall and skeletal, wrapped in a long, greasy duster despite the cold. He rode a mean-looking black horse. He moved like a spider, his eyes scanning everything, missing nothing. He rode past Eli, his gaze sweeping over him without recognition, and headed straight for the saloon. Eli froze. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't have to. He knew the type. This was a manhunter. This was a man who worked for money, who smelled of death. This was Wesley's man. The fragile, warm world he and Clara had built shattered like ice. He didn't walk. He ran. He took the back stairs to the room 2 at a time, bursting through the door. Clara was there. She had stew on the stove again. She had set 2 plates. She looked up, her face bright, her smile starting. The smile died when she saw his face. "Eli, what is it? What's wrong?" "He's here." His voice was a harsh rasp. He was already pulling their few belongings together, shoving them into his saddlebag. "Who?" she breathed, her hand flying to her throat. "A man, a hunter. Your brother sent him. I know it." Clara went bone white, but she did not panic. She did not freeze. She calmly dumped the stew from their plates into a cloth and wrapped it. She grabbed the new green dress she wasn't wearing and her sewing kit. She was a different woman from the one who had cowered in Wesley's cabin. "The horse is at the livery," he said, checking his revolver, his movements fast and precise. "We go out the back. We don't run. We just walk. Head for the stables. Now." He grabbed her hand, and they slipped out the back door, down the stairs, and into the cold, darkening alley. The alley smelled of trash and cold mud, a stark contrast to the warm bread they were leaving. They were halfway to the street when Clara stopped. She pulled on his hand, making him pause. She looked back at the bakery, at the small, dark window of their room under the eaves. "Eli," she whispered, and her voice broke. Tears streamed down her face. Not the wild sobs of the cabin, but the silent, scalding tears of true loss. "I was just beginning," she wept, her hand gripping his. "I was just beginning to feel like I belonged." Eli's face was hard as granite. He pulled her against his side, his arm locking around her waist. "I know," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We'll find another place. I promise you, Clara, we'll find one." He pulled her out of the alley and into the shadows of the main street, walking steady, his eyes on the saloon, his other hand on his gun. They were running again. They didn't walk, they fled. Eli kept to the shadows, his hand on her arm, moving fast toward the livery. The tall man in the duster had not come out of the saloon. Not yet. But the feeling of being watched, of a timer running out, was a physical weight on Eli's shoulders. He paid the hostler with his last silver dollar, his eyes scanning the street. He boosted Clara onto the bay, then swung up behind her. He didn't dig his heels in. He didn't bolt. He walked the horse steady, calm, down the main street, past the Mercantile, past the Whispers, and out onto the muddy track leading north, as if they were just a couple heading out for an evening ride. The moment the last cabin of Cutler's Gap disappeared behind a stand of cottonwoods, he spurred the horse. They rode hard into the darkness, leaving the valley and climbing back into the teeth of the mountains. This was not the high, snowy pass they had come through. This was a lower, wetter range, a maze of sharp granite ridges and deep, dark canyons. And the rain began. It was not the clean, cleansing snow of the high peaks. It was a cold, miserable, driving rain that turned the world to a gray smear. It soaked them to the bone within an hour. The temperature dropped, and the rain became a stinging sleet, then a wet, heavy snow that didn't settle, but melted, turning the trails to treacherous mudslides. For days, they moved. They were not two people, but one creature, huddled together on the horse's back for warmth. At night, they didn't risk a fire. Eli would find a shallow overhang, a space beneath a tangle of ancient, fallen pines, and they would huddle together in his bedroll, the horse standing guard nearby. Clara stopped weeping. Her grief for the small, warm room had been scoured away by the cold. There was no room for it. There was only the next step, the next ridge, the next icy morning. She was no longer the trembling, silent passenger. She was his partner. When they stopped, she was the first off the horse, rubbing its legs down, checking its hooves. She shared the watches with him, her eyes straining into the darkness, listening. One night, they heard it, the long, howling cry, closer than before. Wolves, a big pack, smelling the horse. Or perhaps just them. Eli had his rifle out, checking the load. Clara sat with her back to him, her own knife in her hand, watching the shadows. "They're hungry," she whispered. Her voice didn't tremble. It was flat, a statement of fact. "They'll keep their distance," he said, but his hand was tight on the rifle. The wolves circled their camp all night, their eyes like pairs of yellow-green lanterns in the dark, but they never came in. At dawn, they were gone. Clara hadn't slept. She had just watched. When the sun rose, she looked at Eli, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes steady. "You need to teach me," she said. "Teach you what?" "To shoot, to use that." She nodded at the rifle. "You can't be the only one. If something happens to you, I will not be taken. I need to know how to use it." He looked at her for a long time. He saw the woman she had become. She was not the girl from Bitter Creek. She was not the refugee from the bakery. This was someone new, forged in the wind and the cold. "All right," he said. They were in a small, sheltered meadow, the horse grazing on the tough winter grass. The rain had stopped. He pulled the Winchester from its scabbard. It was a heavy, serious weapon. "It's not like your brother's pistol," he said. "It's got a kick. It'll bruise your shoulder. You have to hold it tight, tight against you. Don't be afraid of it. You respect it. You don't fear it." He showed her how to work the lever action, how to chamber around, how to line up the sights. You don't pull the trigger. You squeeze it, slow. Let the gun surprise you when it goes. He set a pine cone on a stump 50 yards away. Clara took the rifle. It was heavier than she'd expected. The wood smooth, the metal cold. She did as he said, pulling the stock tight into her shoulder. She lined up the sights, her left hand steady on the forestock. "Breathe out," he said, his voice quiet beside her. "Breathe out, and then squeeze." She let out her breath. She squeezed. The crack of the rifle was deafening. The kick was a solid, brutal punch that slammed into her, shocking her. She stumbled back a step. The pine cone was untouched. Her shoulder throbbed. Tears of pain sprang to her eyes. "Again," Eli said. She chambered another round, the motion clumsy. She set her feet. She pulled the stock in so hard she thought it would break her. She aimed, breathed, squeezed. The shot went wide. "You're flinching," he said. "You're waiting for the kick. Don't wait for it. Just let it happen. You are in control. Clara, not the gun." She looked at him, her shoulder on fire, her pride stinging. She nodded. She loaded the rifle. She raised it. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and found the target. The world narrowed to the front sight and the small, brown shape of the cone. She didn't think about the noise. She didn't think about the kick. She thought about Wesley. She thought about the man in the duster. She squeezed. The rifle bucked, but she held her ground. The pine cone exploded, disappearing in a puff of woody debris. She lowered the rifle, her arms shaking. A slow, fierce smile touched her lips. Eli just stared at her. He looked at her steady hands, at the new, hard light in her eyes. "You're not who you were," he said, his voice rough with a kind of awe. Clara ejected the spent cartridge, the metal shell spinning, hot, onto the grass. She looked at him, the man who had abandoned his own safety to save her, the man who had shared his warmth and his past, the man who was now, impossibly, her partner. "Neither are you," she replied. That night, they risked a fire. They were deep in the mountains, and the cold was too deep to ignore. Eli had shot a rabbit, and the smell of it roasting was a small, defiant piece of hope in the vast, cold darkness. They sat close, sharing the meat, their shoulders touching. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. "That man in Cutler's Gap," Eli said suddenly, staring into the flames. "The one with the duster. I know his kind." Clara waited. "They ride for money. They don't stop. They don't sleep. They just track. He'll find our trail. It might take him days, but he'll find it." "We'll be gone," Clara said. "He won't be the first to track me," Eli said. His voice was low, haunted. He was not talking about Wesley's men anymore. He was somewhere else. Years ago. "Eli?" she prompted, her voice soft. He turned his head, his scarred face a mask of old pain in the firelight. "When I told you about Sarah, about the man who took my land, I didn't tell you all of it." He picked up a stick, poking at the fire. "I left. I rode west, but there was another man. Before that. During the war. Not a soldier, just an animal. He was one of ours, a sutler. He was hurting a woman, a laundress. She was just a girl, really. She was screaming." His hand tightened on the stick, his knuckles white. "The other men, they just laughed. They were drunk. They said it was his right. I told him to stop. He pulled a knife. He was bigger than me. He came at me." Eli stared at the fire, but he was seeing that night, that girl. "I had my revolver. I shot him. I shot him 3 times, right in the chest. He just stood there for a second, looking surprised. Then he fell, and he was dead." He dropped the stick. He looked at Clara, his eyes begging her to understand. "It wasn't a fair fight. Clara, he had a knife. I had a gun. But it wasn't war. I killed him. And the girl, she just kept screaming. She looked at me, at the man on the floor, and she ran. She looked at me like I was the monster." He put his head in his hands. "It's haunted me ever since. That's the truth of me. I'm not a good man. I'm just a man who's quicker to violence than most. And sometimes I don't know if I'm saving someone, or just finding an excuse to be what I am." The confession hung in the cold air, raw and bleeding. He had given her his deepest shame, the ghost that rode with him. Clara was silent for a long moment. She saw him. She saw the man who had flinched at her touch, the man who had refused to take her when she was vulnerable, the man who had struck Taggart for a word. It all made a terrible, beautiful sense. She moved, shifting to kneel in front of him. She took his hands, pulling them away from his face. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Gently, she cupped his face, her palms against his rough, scarred cheeks. She made him look at her.
"The first time,"
she said, her voice clear and strong as a bell,
"was at the outpost, when you spoke, when you said, 'Not while I breathe.' You saved my life then. You saved me from Wesley, from Jed. You saved my body."
She leaned in, her forehead touching his.
"Tonight," she whispered, "by telling me this, by trusting me with this, you saved me from being the girl who was just saved. You made me your equal."
She kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of acceptance, a kiss that sealed a wound. It was soft and true, and it tasted of wood smoke and loyalty. She pulled back, her eyes holding his. "Then you've already saved me twice." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 10 years. He didn't speak. He just pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and held her.
He was not the savior. She was not the victim. They were just two people holding on in the dark.
They found the camp 2 days later, by accident. They were following a dry riverbed, a narrow, winding canyon that seemed to lead nowhere. Eli was weak with hunger, and the horse was limping. The canyon opened up, and there it was. It was a small, ruined settlement of a dozen cabins, clinging to the steep canyon wall. A massive, rusted ore cart lay on its side. A pickaxe was still embedded in a rock face, but it was silent, utterly, terribly silent. "A mining camp," Eli said, his hand on his gun.
"But it's dead."
They walked the horse in. The place was a grave. A cabin door hung open, a table inside set for a meal that had never been finished. Mugs were half full of dried sludge. Tools were scattered, dropped where men had been working.
"What happened?"
Clara whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. Eli pointed up the canyon wall.
"There, a collapse. The main adit. It's buried under half the mountain."
The town had been abandoned in a single, terrifying moment. The survivors had fled, leaving the dead, and the tools, and the ghosts. It was eerie. It was a place of profound sorrow. And it was safe. It was hidden, tucked away in a box canyon, invisible from any high trail. It had shelter. It had supplies. "We stay," Eli said, "just for a little while, to rest, to heal the horse." They chose the smallest, most solid cabin, the one that had belonged to the assayer. It had a sound roof, a small stove, and a bed frame with the rope still intact. For a week, they lived in the town of ghosts, and in that place of death, they found a quiet, tender life. Eli hunted. The canyon, abandoned by men, was full of game, rabbits, and even a small deer. He brought back meat, and they cooked it in an old iron pot Clara had scoured clean in the creek. She fixed the cabin. She found a broom. She swept out the dust of years. She found burlap sacks and patched the gaps in the walls. She found an old, water-damaged Bible on a shelf, its pages stiff and yellowed. At night, by the light of a candle she'd made from rendered deer fat, she would read to him. Her voice was the only human sound in the canyon, reading the old words, the Psalms, the stories of loss and deliverance. Eli, in turn, worked with his hands. He took a piece of smooth, cured pine he'd found, and with his knife, he began to carve. He worked on it every night, the small shavings falling onto the floor. On the 5th night, he presented it to her. It was a comb. The teeth were perfectly spaced, the back carved with a simple, winding pattern of a vine. Clara's breath caught. She took it, her hands trembling. It was the first beautiful thing she had owned in her life. It was the first thing anyone had ever made for her. She had no words. She just threw her arms around his neck and held him. He was stiff, unused to the easy affection, but his arms came around her, holding her tight. The next day, she set to work. She had her sewing kit. She found an old, moth-eaten wool blanket in one of the other cabins. She spent 2 days carefully unraveling the threads, washing them. And then
Using 2 straight sticks as needles, she began to knit. Her fingers, clumsy at first, remembered the motions her mother had taught her. She made him a scarf. It was a rough, mottled gray thing, but it was thick and warm. She gave it to him that evening. He took it, his rough fingers touching the wool. He didn't speak. He just wrapped it around his neck and then pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers. The quiet domesticity, the shared tasks, the small gifts, it had banked a fire in them. The peace and safety of the hidden canyon had allowed something else to grow. Their desire, when it returned, was not the desperate, tender comfort of the bakery room. It was something deeper, wilder. It was born of the mountains, of the shared fear, of the confessions by the fire. That night, they didn't go into the cabin. The air was clear and cold, the sky a vast, glittering spray of stars, brighter than any she had ever seen. Eli built a bed of soft pine needles in a sheltered spot, just outside their door, shielded by the rocks. He pulled her down onto it. There were no words. There was no hesitation. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the starlight. He saw the woman who had faced him down, the woman who had learned to shoot, the woman who had read to him from the Bible and knit him a scarf with her own hands. She looked at him, the man who had killed, the man who had confessed, the man who had carved her a comb from scrap wood. This was not a rescue. This was a claiming. They made love under the open sky, in the ghost town, surrounded by the silent, watchful mountains. It was a wild, hungry, desperate act. It was a promise, a vow made not with words, but with bodies. It was a burst of life, a defiant shout against the silence, the cold, and the death that surrounded them. They lay tangled in the bedroll, their breath pluming in the cold air, their hearts pounding in unison. The stars wheeled overhead. For the first time, Clara felt a deep, profound peace. She was home. A gunshot shattered the night. The crack of the rifle was impossibly loud, echoing off the canyon walls. It was followed by the high, deadly zing of a bullet ricocheting off the rock just above their heads. Clara screamed. Eli was moving before the echo died. He rolled off her, shoving her behind the meager cover of the pine boughs, his revolver already in his hand. "Get to the cabin. Stay down." Another shot, a muzzle flash, high on the canyon rim. They had been found. The man in the duster, Shaw. "They're up on the ridge," Eli yelled, firing his own pistol up at the flash, a desperate, covering shot. Clara scrambled on her hands and knees toward the cabin door. A third shot. This one was not at her. It was at Eli. She heard the thwack of the bullet hitting flesh. She heard Eli cry out, a sharp, grunting sound of pain, and saw him stumble. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice tearing. He was hit. He was on one knee, clutching his side, but he was still firing, spacing his shots, making the man on the ridge keep his head down. "Get inside!" he roared at her, the voice strained with agony. She made it, tumbling through the doorway, her heart exploding in her chest. She grabbed the Winchester from where it leaned against the wall. "Clara, the horse!" Eli yelled, crawling backward toward the cabin. "Through the back! There's a game trail! Go! Go now!" "I'm not leaving you!" she shrieked. She came out the door, low, and laid the rifle on the threshold, firing up at the ridge. She didn't aim, she just fired, working the lever, providing her own covering fire. The shot from the ridge stopped. The man was moving, likely coming down. Eli grabbed her, his face pale and slick with sweat in the moonlight. "We have to run, now. Both of us. The horse is too slow. We go on foot, into the rocks." He was bleeding. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his shirt, high on his left side, near his ribs. "How bad?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It's a graze. It just hurts. I can move." He was lying. She knew he was lying. He shoved her toward the back of the camp, into the deep shadows where the canyon narrowed. They ran,
stumbling over the debris of the ghost town. They could hear the scrape of boots on rock above them. The hunter was coming. They scrambled up a narrow chimney of rock, Eli pushing her from behind. He was breathing in harsh, wet gasps. They made it to a small ledge, 100 yards from the camp, and collapsed into the shadows. They watched as 2 men moved into the camp below, the tall man in the duster, Shaw, and the other one, the half-Comanche, Red. They were checking the cabin, their rifles ready. 2 of them, Eli whispered, his head leaning back against the rock. He was already weak. "We have to keep moving," Clara said, pulling at his arm. They moved. They climbed. They slipped and fell in the darkness. Eli was a dead weight. He was not just grazed. He was bleeding badly. After an hour, he collapsed. He slid down a rock face and landed in a heap in a shallow draw. "I can't," he panted, his hand pressed to his side. It was soaked in blood. "You have to go. Clara, I'll hold them here." "No." She stood over him, the Winchester in her hand. She looked back the way they had come. Then she looked at him. This man who had saved her, this man she loved. "Get up," she ordered. "Clara, I can't go." "I said, get up." Her voice was the crack of a whip. It was a voice he had never heard. It was not the voice of a seamstress. It was the voice of a survivor. "You will not die here. I won't let you." He was too weak. He tried, but he couldn't get his legs under him. "All right," she said, her voice softening, her mind racing. She was the strong one now. She was the leader. She grabbed him under the arms. "Help me! Just help me!" She hauled him to his feet. He screamed, a low, guttural sound as the movement tore at his wound. "I know it hurts," she whispered, her voice fierce, her arms shaking from his weight. "I know, but we have to go. Put your arm over me, now. Eli, walk." She was no longer the one being led. She was no longer the one being carried. He was leaning on her, his blood dripping onto her shoulder. He was weak, fading, but she was strong. She had his weight, and she had the rifle. She looked into the darkness, searching for any sign of cover, any place to hide, any place to make a stand. She saw a dark shape against the skyline, a cleft in the rocks, a shallow cave. "There," she said. "We're going there." She put her shoulder under his arm, took his full weight, and began to drag him toward the darkness, toward shelter, leading the way. The cave was a shallow crack in the rock, barely deep enough to escape the wind. It offered no comfort, only a grim, frozen shelter from the night. Clara hauled Eli into the darkness, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. He was a dead weight, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Here," she panted, lowering him to the stone floor. "We're safe. We're hidden." He moaned, his hand slipping from the dark, wet stain on his side. It was so much blood. In the faint moonlight that reached the cave's mouth, his face was a pale, waxy gray. He was dying. "No," she whispered, the word a raw tear in her throat. "You will not." She was the strong one. She had to be. She had the rifle, his revolver, and the saddlebag she'd had the presence of mind to grab. Inside it, a knife, a strip of jerky, and her sewing kit. She had nothing to make a fire, no blankets, no medicine. And the snow began to fall. Not a gentle flurry, but a thick, wet, driving snow, blown by a wind that moaned like a grieving woman. The cold was a physical thing, a predator. It crept into the cave, settling over them. Eli began to shiver, a violent bone-rattling shake that tore a weak groan from his chest. "Cold," he whispered, his eyes rolling back. "So cold." Fire. She had to make a fire, but she had no flint, no steel. He had them, on his belt. She fumbled at his waist, her fingers numb, and found his tinderbox. She pulled it free. She searched the cave, her hands scraping against the rock. It was bare stone, damp, But at the very back, a pack rat had made a nest, a dry, messy tangle of twigs, grass, and shredded bark. It was a miracle. She pulled the nest apart, found the driest core, and laid it in a sheltered hollow. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely strike the flint. A spark. Nothing. Again. A tiny spark caught a piece of dry tinder. She blew on it, gently, desperately, her own breath a prayer. A small, orange ember glowed. She fed it twigs. A tiny, flickering flame was born. It was a fragile, pathetic thing against the immense cold. It needed fuel. There was no wood. She looked at Eli. He was fading. His shivering was weakening, a sign of the end. If the fire died, he died. Clara stood up. She took the hem of her green wool dress, the dress she had made in the warm bakery room, the one that represented her first step toward a new life. She put Eli's knife to the seam and tore it. The sound of ripping cloth was loud in the small cave. She fed a strip of the heavy wool to the fire. It smoked, stank, and then caught, burning with a low, sullen heat. It was not enough. She looked at the dress, then at the man. It was not a choice. She took off the dress. She stood in the freezing, wind-blasted cave in her thin cotton shift, her skin instantly rising in painful goose flesh. She tore the dress into long strips. It was her only other garment. It was her only protection. She fed the wool to the fire, piece by piece, hoarding the heat. Then she took his bedroll. It was still tied to the saddlebag, and unrolled it. She stripped off his wet, bloody shirt. The wound was a dark, ragged tear in his side. It was deep. It was still weeping blood. She took the last, largest piece of her dress and pressed it hard against the wound. He cried out, a thin, weak sound. "I know," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I know. I'm sorry." She wrapped him in the bedroll. She took his canvas coat, the one she had worn in the snow, and laid it over him. She took the wool scarf she had knitted for him and wrapped it around his neck. She took off her own boots and forced them onto his feet, which were larger, but she managed. She was left in her shift, barefoot on the frozen stone. She huddled by the tiny, stinking fire, feeding it her dress, strip by strip, and watched him. He burned. The fever took him just before dawn. He faded in and out of a dark, muttering world. He spoke to shadows. "Sarah, you lied! You lied!" he thrashed, his good arm trying to push away the blankets. "Shh, Eli," Clara whispered, her voice raw. She pushed him back down, her small, freezing body pinning him. "It's me. It's Clara. You're safe." He didn't know her. His eyes were open, but he saw the war. "On the line! Hold the line! They're in the trees!" She bathed his face with snow she melted in her hands over the fire. It did nothing. He was burning from the inside, the wound poisoned. She was so cold she could no longer feel her feet. She was lightheaded, dizzy, but she did not sleep. She watched him, and she fed the fire. On the second day, he grew quiet. His fever spiked. His breathing was so shallow she had to put her ear to his lips to feel it. She thought he was gone. She crawled under the blankets with him, pressing her own frigid body against his furnace heat, trying to anchor him to the world. She had nothing left. The dress was gone. The jerky was gone. The fire was dying. She began to cry, not the loud, angry sobs of the storm, but the quiet, hopeless tears of absolute loss. She laid her head on his chest, her body shaking. She sang to him, the only song she could remember, a lullaby her mother had sung, a simple, foolish song about a riverboat and a silver moon. Her voice was a cracked, broken whisper in the darkness. She sang it over and over, her tears wetting his skin, until her voice gave out. She must have fallen into a stupor, a half-sleep of cold and exhaustion. She woke with a start. The cave was gray with the light of the third day. It was silent. He was no longer breathing. "No," she choked.
No, Eli, don't you dare leave me. You saved me. You don't get to leave me.
She shook him, her small, bare hands pounding on his chest.
Wake up, Eli.
His eyes fluttered. They were not clear, but they were not blind with fever. He looked at her. He saw her, her face, stained with soot and tears, her hair, matted and wild, her body, clad only in a torn, thin shift, blue with cold. He tried to lift his hand. It was a weak, trembling gesture. He touched her cheek. His fingers were still hot, but the fire was less.
You're freezing,
he whispered. His voice was a dry rattle.
It doesn't matter,
she sobbed. He looked around. He saw the ashes of the fire. He saw the last, singed scrap of green wool. He understood what she had done. Foolish, he breathed. He used his good arm to pull back the blankets he was wrapped in.
Get in, now.
No,
Clara, get in, or I'll die right here. I swear I will.
She obeyed. She slid under the heavy canvas and wool, into the nest of his body heat. It was like sinking into a hot bath. The pain of the returning warmth was agonizing, but she didn't care. He was alive. He held her, his arm weak but firm. They lay in silence for a long time.
Why?
He whispered, his lips against her hair. Why what?
Why all this? You should have run. I told you to run.
She turned her head, her face buried in his shoulder.
You know why.
He was quiet. She could feel his heart, slow and labored, but steady, beating.
Clara,
he said, his voice stronger.
Yes.
You're the first reason, he said, each word an effort. The first reason I've wanted to live in years. He pulled her closer, his hand gripping her hair, and then he fell back into a true, healing sleep. It took them 4 days to reach the homestead, 4 days of walking through a melting, slushy hell. Eli was a ghost of himself, but he was alive. The fever had broken, but the wound was deep, and he had lost too much blood. He walked, leaning on her, his arm draped over her shoulders, her small frame taking almost his entire weight. She had wrapped her feet in strips of the saddle blanket. She had his coat on, and he had the bedroll wrapped around him like a shroud. He guided her.
North, follow this ridge. There's a creek, the Sweetwater. Follow it down.
What's there?
Friends,
he panted, his head hanging.
Josiah Freeman. We rode together. Before I met you.
She did not ask more. She just put one foot in front of the other. She carried the rifle. She carried him. She was no longer a seamstress. She was a mule, a soldier, a nurse. She was whatever she had to be. On the 4th day, they crested a low hill and saw it. A small, neat ranch tucked into a cottonwood grove. A solid-looking sod house with real glass windows. A big, sturdy barn. Smoke rose from the chimney, straight and clean.
We're here,
Eli breathed, and then his legs gave out. He collapsed, pulling her down with him. The ranch door opened. A man came out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and black. He held a rifle in the crook of his arm. He saw them, a heap of rags in the mud, and he leveled the gun.
That's far enough,
he boomed.
Josiah,
Eli called out, his voice a dry croak.
Josiah, it's me. It's McCall.
The man froze. He lowered the rifle. He walked toward them, his boots sucking in the mud. He stopped a few feet away, his face a mask of disbelief. Lord God in heaven, he said, his voice dropping. Eli, is that you? What in God's name happened to you?
No time, Joe,
Eli whispered.
Hunters, they're behind us.
Josiah didn't ask another question. He was a man of action. He scooped Eli up in his arms as if he were a child and started carrying him toward the house.
Hattie,
he bellowed.
Bring the kid. It's Eli. He's shot.
A woman burst from the door. She was the female version of Josiah. Tall, strong, her face lined with wisdom and hard work. She held a basket in her hands. She saw Clara stumbling behind, barefoot, filthy, and half naked under the man's coat. "And bring blankets, woman!" Josiah shouted. Hattie met Clara at the door. She didn't speak. She just put one strong arm around her, pulled her inside, and sat her by the huge, roaring fireplace. She wrapped her in a thick wool blanket and pressed a steaming mug of broth into her hands. "Drink," she commanded. Her voice was deep, rich, and held no pity, only strength. Clara drank. The hot, salty liquid was the best thing she had ever tasted. She watched, numb, as Josiah and Hattie cut away Eli's bandages, their hands working together with practiced skill. "It's clean," Hattie said, her voice low. "Healed on its own, barely, but he's lost blood, and he's starved." "They'll be here soon." "Hattie," Eli whispered from the cot they'd laid him on. "The men who did this, they're tracking us. You shouldn't get involved." Josiah, who was washing the wound, paused. He looked at his friend. "You think I'm going to let a man I rode with, a man who shared his last biscuit with me on the Brazos, get turned out? You bleed in my house. Eli, your family, and we protect our family." Hattie looked at Clara, who was shaking in the blanket. "And his woman, too." Hattie led Clara to a small back room. There was a tub of hot water, a bar of lye soap, and a simple, clean dress of gray wool. "You wash," Hattie said. "You put this on. You burn what you're wearing. Then you come out, and you eat. And you tell me who we're fighting." Clara sat in the steaming water, scrubbing away the grime of the ghost town, the cave, the trail. She scrubbed away the blood and the soot. When she was clean, she put on the gray dress. It was too big, but it was warm. It was whole. She found Hattie in the kitchen, kneading dough. Eli was asleep on the cot, Josiah outside, watching the ridge. Clara stood by the table, her hands clasped. "He said I was ruined," Clara said, her voice quiet. Hattie didn't stop kneading. "Who did?" "My brother. He tried to sell me to ranchers for his debts. He called me livestock, the whole town. They call me the sold girl." Eli stopped him. "He took me, and we've been running ever since. Wesley, my brother, he hired hunters. They're the ones who shot Eli." She looked at her hands. "I don't even know what I am anymore. I'm just ruined." Hattie slammed the dough onto the floured board. Thwack! She looked at Clara, her dark eyes sharp, missing nothing. She saw the girl who had walked out of the mountains, who had kept that man alive, who had worn his coat and his coat alone. "You ain't ruined, child," Hattie said, her voice soft but with an edge of steel. "Ruined is when they break you inside. Ruined is when you give up. Ruined is when you start believing what they call you." She gestured with a floured hand at Clara. "You walked through hell. You kept that man breathing when he had no right to be. You stood on your own 2 feet, and you walked here." Hattie turned back to her dough, her hands working fast. "You're not ruined," she said, her voice ringing with a profound, unshakable truth. "You're risen." Clara stared at her. The word settled in her heart. Risen. It was a new word. It was a true word. She stood up taller. A shout from outside. "Josiah! Riders! 3 of them! They're coming up the path!" Clara's blood went cold. Eli was instantly awake, grabbing for a gun that wasn't there. "Stay down! Eli!" Josiah said, coming inside, his rifle in his hand. "Hattie, bar the back. Take the rifle." "No," Clara said. They all looked at her. She walked to the door. She opened it and stepped out onto the porch. They were there, Wesley, his face a mask of rage and triumph. The tall, skeletal man in the duster. Shaw, and the half-Comanche. Red, his eyes as dead as a snake's. They sat on their horses, 20 yards from the house. "Clara!" Wesley screamed, his voice cracking.
You whore! You'll pay for this! Get down here! Wesley, Clara said, and her voice carried, clear and cold as the mountain air. She was not the girl he had slapped. She was not the girl he had sold. You will not call me that, she said, and you will not take me again. She's mine! Wesley shrieked at Josiah, who had come to stand beside Clara, his rifle held ready. That's my property! My sister! She don't look like property to me, Josiah said, his voice a low rumble. She looks like a free woman, on my land. This ain't your fight, old man, Shaw said, his voice a dry rasp. He nudged his horse forward. We just want the girl, and the man who stole her. Give them to us, and we'll be on our way. No, Clara said. Shaw smiled. It was a terrible sight. Then we'll just take you, and we'll kill him, and we'll kill these two for hiding you. You want her? Eli's voice. He was at the door, leaning on the frame, his face as pale as death, but in his hand he held his revolver. You want her? He repeated, his voice shaking with weakness but ringing with fury. You'll have to bury me first. Wesley looked at Eli, at the man he hated. He looked at his sister, who was defying him. He screamed, a wordless sound of pure rage, and drew his pistol. Kill them all! He shrieked. It all happened at once. Wesley fired. The shot went wild. Shaw drew, his hand a blur, his gun aimed at Eli, the biggest threat. Josiah fired his rifle. The heavy boom echoed as he shot at Red, who was flanking them. Clara didn't scream. She didn't run. She grabbed the Winchester that Hattie had brought to the door and raised it, just as Eli had taught her. She found Wesley in her sights. Josiah's shot hit Red in the chest, knocking him clean off his horse. He was dead before he hit the mud. Shaw fired at Eli. The bullet tore into the doorframe, sending splinters flying. Eli fired back, his shot low, but Shaw's horse screamed and reared, hit in the neck. Wesley was fumbling, trying to aim at Clara. She squeezed the trigger. The kick slammed her shoulder, but her aim was true. She had not aimed for his heart. She had aimed for his gun hand. The bullet tore through his wrist, shattering the bone. His pistol flew into the air. He howled, a high, thin sound of pure animal pain, clutching his ruined hand. Shaw's horse went down, pinning his leg. He cursed, trying to pull himself free. Wesley, screaming, his fight gone, his bravado vanished, turned his horse and fled, galloping madly back down the path, one-handed. Shaw, trapped, looked at Josiah, who was reloading. He looked at Clara, who was already levering another round into the chamber, her face hard as stone. He raised his one free hand. All right, he rasped. I'm done. It was over. Clara lowered the rifle, her body shaking. Josiah kept his gun on Shaw. Hattie, get the rope! Eli, Clara breathed, turning. He was still in the doorway, but his gun was pointed at the ground. He looked at her. He saw the woman with the rifle, the woman who had faced down her brother, the woman who had shot a man to protect her home. He smiled, a slow, proud, tired smile. You did it, Clara, he whispered. And then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, sliding down the doorframe to lie in a heap on the porch. Eli! She screamed. She ran to him. He was breathing, but there was a new bright red stain on his shirt, high on his chest, on the other side. Shaw's first shot had not missed entirely. It had torn through the wood and hit him. He had been shot again. She grabbed him, trying to pull him up. No, Eli, no! Hattie was there. He's alive. Help me, child. Let's get him inside. Together, they dragged him across the threshold, away from the blood and the death on the porch. They laid him on the floor by the fire. Hattie ripped his shirt open. The bullet was still in him. It was bad. Hold him down, Hattie said, pulling a bottle of whiskey and a thin, curved needle from her kit. No,
Clara said, pushing her aside. She grabbed the needle. She grabbed the thread.
I'll do it.
Hattie looked at the girl's hands, steady as stone. She looked at her eyes, burning with a fierce, possessive light. She nodded. Clara poured whiskey on the wound, on the needle, on her hands. Eli was unconscious. She took a deep breath. She started to stitch. Her hands, the hands of a seamstress, moved with a swift, terrible precision, pulling the torn flesh together. She was crying, but the tears didn't make her hands shake. She was whispering the words of fierce, hot promise to the unconscious man, to the world, to God. "You're mine now," she whispered, pulling the thread tight. "You're mine, Eli McCall, and I won't let you go." The bullet was lead, the needle was steel, and the thread was Clara's. She stitched him together by the light of Hattie Freeman's hearth, her hands moving with a grim, unwavering purpose. The wound in his chest was ugly, a ragged punctuation mark to the one in his side. Hattie held the lantern, her dark face calm, offering quiet encouragement. "That's it, child. Pull it snug. Don't you fear the needle. It's a friend. It mends what's torn." Eli was lost to them, mercifully unconscious, his life held by the thin, waxed thread in Clara's hand. She finished the last stitch, her body slick with sweat, her arms shaking from a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in her bones. "Now the real work starts," Hattie said, covering the wound with a clean, boiled cloth. Months passed, measured not by the calendar, but by the slow, agonizing crawl of Eli's recovery. Winter seized the homestead, burying them in drifts of deep, silent snow. The world shrank to the four walls of the sod house. Josiah had dealt with the hunters. He and Hattie never spoke of it. Clara had seen him ride out with 2 shovels and come back hours later, his face set like iron. He had returned Shaw's horse to the livery in Cutler's Gap, saying only that the man had moved on. The law in that part of the territory was satisfied to let sleeping dogs lie.
Eli's fight was internal. The chest wound festered. For 2 weeks, he burned, lost in a red haze of fever, his voice a low, constant murmur of border skirmishes and dead men's names. Clara did not leave him. She sat by his cot, a ghost in Hattie's gray wool dress. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips. She bathed his burning skin with snow water. She held his hand when he thrashed, her small, determined grip an anchor against the tide pulling him away. Josiah and Hattie watched her. They had taken in a half-dead gunman and a terrified girl, but the girl was gone. In her place was a woman with old eyes and a spine of forged steel. Slowly, as the deepest cold of January settled in, the fever broke. Eli woke. He woke to a world of weakness. He was a man defined by his strength, by his speed, by his ability to act. Now, he was a prisoner in his own body, unable to lift his head. He watched. He watched Clara. She was not the woman he had saved. She was a different creature entirely. The softness of the seamstress was gone, burned away. Her hands, which he remembered as pale and deft with a needle, were now red, chapped, and strong. She did not just nurse him. She worked. She earned their keep. Eli watched her through the small glass window as she followed Hattie to the barn in the pre-dawn chill, the lantern swinging between them. He heard her hesitant, then steady voice as she learned to milk the cow. He saw her come back inside, her hair damp with melted snow, her face raw from the wind, and she never complained. One afternoon, he watched her go to the woodpile. Josiah had left the axe. She picked it up. It was far too heavy for her. She swung it, all arms, and the blade bounced uselessly off a thick pine round. She stumbled, frustrated. Eli tried to sit up, a hot spike of pain shooting through his chest. "Clara, don't! You'll hurt yourself."
She didn't look at him. She just set her feet, raised the axe again, and swung. She missed the wood entirely, the axe head burying itself in the snow.
Josiah came from the barn. He didn't laugh. He didn't take the axe from her. He simply stood beside her. "You're fighting it, Mrs. McCall," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let the weight of the axe do the work. Stand square and breathe out when you strike." Clara nodded, her jaw tight. She swung again, and again. The thwack of the steel was clumsy, then rhythmic. Eli watched her for an hour, until a small, respectable pile of split wood lay at her feet. She was breathing hard, her shoulders slumped, but she was not broken. She was strong. She was capable. She was, as Hattie had said, risen. The Freemans treated her like the daughter they never had. Hattie taught her to make soap, to quilt, to shoot the heavy rifle with a steady hand. Josiah taught her how to read a snow-laden sky, how to track a rabbit, how to bank a fire so it would last the night. They were kin. They had been forged into a family by blood and gunfire, and sealed by the long, quiet winter. Eli healed, but the healing was slow. His body mended, but his spirit was adrift. He saw the woman she had become, and he felt a deep, gnawing shame. He was a burden. He, who had vowed to protect her, was being fed and sheltered by her strength. He was a gunman with no gun, a drifter with no road. He loved her so much it was a physical ache, a hollow pain worse than the bullet wounds. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he had nothing to offer her at all. The news came in March, with the first thaw, a peddler, his wagon wheel sucking at the mud, stopped at the homestead. He brought coffee, sugar, and word from the outside. "You folks heard about the hanging down Bitter Creek way?" he said, sharing a cup of Hattie's coffee by the fire. "Man named Darrow, Wesley Darrow, mean as a snake. They said, got caught robbing the mail stage to Helena. Shot a guard. They didn't even wait for the circuit judge. Held the trial in the saloon and hanged him from a cottonwood an hour later." Clara was mending one of Josiah's shirts. Her needle paused. Just for a second. Thwip! It went back into the cloth. Eli watched her. Hattie watched her. Clara finished the seam, knotted the thread, and bit it clean. She folded the shirt and set it on the table. She stood up and put on her coat. She went outside, to the wood pile. They heard the sound of the axe, a hard, steady, rhythmic crack. Crack! Crack! Hattie followed her out. Clara was splitting wood with a grim, focused efficiency. Her cheeks wet. Hattie wasn't sure if it was from sweat or tears. "Are you all right, child?" Hattie asked, her voice gentle. Clara stopped, resting the axe head on the block. She stared at the mountains, their white peaks sharp against the pale blue spring sky. "He was my brother," she said. Her voice was flat. She wasn't crying. "He was my father's son. I should feel something, sadness, anger. I don't know. I should feel something." "What do you feel?" Clara took a deep, shuddering breath of the cold, clean air. She let it out. "Light," she whispered. "I feel light, like I've been carrying a heavy sack on my back for years, and I just now realized I could put it down." She felt no joy. She felt no sorrow. She just felt release. The last chain that bound her to Bitter Creek, to the girl she had been, was broken. She was free. That night, the four of them sat by the fire. The homestead was quiet. Eli was sitting in a real chair for the first time, his body thin and scarred, but his eyes clear. He was wearing a shirt Hattie had given him, and the wool scarf Clara had made. Josiah and Hattie went to bed, their footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. Eli and Clara were left alone, the firelight flickering between them. She had been quiet all evening. Now, she reached for the small buckskin pouch that held her sewing kit. It was the only thing, besides Eli, that had survived the journey. She pulled out the small, worn packet of needles and the last of her mother's thread. She just held it, staring into the flames. "This old kit," she said, her voice soft. It's all I have left of my mother. I used to think it was just for mending, for patching holes. That's all I ever did. Patching Wesley's shirts, patching my own life." She looked up at Eli. His face was a map of their shared history, the old scar from the war, the new ones from the bullets. "I'm tired of mending. Eli," she said, "Hattie's been teaching me to quilt, how to take all the old useless scraps and make something new, something whole, something warm." She put the sewing kit down. "I want to build something," she said, the words simple, but heavier than stone. "I don't want to run anymore. I want to build a school. I want to build a home." Eli's heart hammered against his newly healed ribs. This was the moment he had been dreading. This was the moment she would see he was empty. He did not speak. He pushed himself out of the chair, his legs stiff, his side aching. He stood before her, a broken man, a drifter who had forgotten how to drift. Slowly, he knelt. It was not a gesture of romance. It was a gesture of surrender. He, the protector, knelt before the woman who had saved him. He took her hand, the one that was chapped and calloused, the one that had held an axe and stitched his life back together. "Clara," he said, his voice thick, choking him. He had to stop, to swallow, to find the words. "You are a builder," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "You're like Hattie. You're like the spring. You make life grow out of nothing. You make things new." He looked down at their joined hands. "I'm a man who breaks things. I'm a man who runs. I have nothing, no land, no money, no name that isn't whispered. I just have these." He touched his own scarred hands. "And the scars you sewed shut." He looked up, his gray eyes clear and full of a terrible, honest pain. "I can't offer you a rich life. I can't give you that schoolhouse with the glass windows. Not tomorrow. I can't give you anything but my word." He gripped her hand, his promise. "But I can offer you a true one, a life where I will work my hands to the bone for you, a life where I will stand between you and the wind, and the cold, and anything else that ever tries to harm you. I will build with you. I will stay. Is that enough?" Clara looked down at him, at this fierce, broken, honorable man, kneeling at her feet. She saw his fear. She saw his shame. And she saw the love, a love so deep and true it staggered her. She didn't say yes. She took his hand and pulled. She pulled him to his feet, her strength surprising him. She rose up, looped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the ghost town. It was not the hesitant, tender kiss of the bakery. It was a long, slow, deep kiss that tasted of wood smoke and salt and promise. It was the kiss of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and had finally, fully claimed it. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his. "It's more than enough." That night, in the small, clean room Hattie had given them, they made love. Their bodies were a testament to their journey. He was all hard angles and ropey scars, his skin a map of violence and survival. She was thin but strong, her hands rough, her spirit blazing. He touched the scar on his chest, the one her needle had made. "You marked me, Clara." She touched the old, white scar on his face, the one that had defined him for so long. "We match," she whispered. This time there was no hunger, no desperation. It was a quiet, reverent confirmation. It was two bodies, healed but still scarred, coming together not to escape, but to build. It was slow, and it was deep, and for the first time in either of their lives, it was joyful. They were married in the spring. It was a quiet wedding. In late April, when the valley was exploding with new life, they stood under a wild plum tree, its branches thick with white blossoms that drifted down around them like a gentle, fragrant snow. Hattie was Clara's attendant. Josiah, holding his father's worn Bible, stood before them. The only sound was the creek rushing with meltwater and the buzz of bees in the blossoms. They had no rings.
Eli had carved her a small, beautiful hawk from a piece of cottonwood, a symbol of her fierce spirit. He gave it to her. Clara gave him her hand. "I will stand with you," Eli said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I will build with you," she replied, her voice clear and strong. Josiah smiled. "Then, by the grace of God and the laws of this territory, I reckon you're well and truly one. You may kiss your wife, son." Eli did. They built their home on a piece of land in the next valley, a parcel Josiah owned and gave to them as a wedding gift. "Family needs room," he'd said.
It was not a house. It was a school.
It was a small, one-room structure, built of sod and thick planks Eli had cut and planed himself. It took him 2 years. 2 years of hard, brutal, joyous labor. Clara worked beside him, chinking the walls, glazing the windows. 2 big glass windows he had traded a winter's worth of pelts for. He built the desks. She bought the slates. On a bright Tuesday in September, Clara Darrow McCall stood at the front of her classroom. The schoolhouse smelled of new pine, chalk, and the stew she had simmering on the pot-bellied stove in the back. Her students were a mismatched bunch, the 2 Freeman grandchildren, 3 shy children from a neighboring homestead, a quiet, half-Shoshone boy who had ridden in with his father. 7 children in all.
"Good morning,"
Clara said, her voice full, her heart overflowing.
"My name is Mrs.
McCall, and we are going to learn how to read." Outside, Eli was building a fence. He was splitting rails, his movements powerful and sure. He was broader now, his shoulders thick with the muscle of hard labor. The wind was sharp, carrying the first hint of autumn, but he was warm from the work. He stopped, leaning on the post-hole digger, and wiped the sweat from his face with the scarf she had made him. He looked at the schoolhouse, their schoolhouse. He looked through the clean glass window. He saw her. She was standing at a slate, her back to him, her hand moving, explaining something to the children. She was where she belonged. She was home. His face, so often a mask of hardness and pain, softened. His eyes, once so cold and watchful, were filled with a quiet, profound, and overwhelming love. He was a man who had found his purpose. He was not a drifter. He was a husband. He was a builder. As if she felt his gaze, she paused. She turned, her face lit by the morning sun. She looked across the yard, past the children, and saw him. She smiled. It was not the broken, hesitant smile of the girl in the bakery. It was the full, warm, radiant smile of a woman who was loved, a woman who was safe, a woman who was whole. She saw him, her partner, her protector, her home. She gave him a small, certain nod. Eli nodded back, a promise renewed. He picked up his tools and went back to building their fence. He saved me when no one else would, and I loved him when he didn't believe he deserved it. Thank you so much for listening to our story. It means the world to us. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more tales just like this one. And finally, please share your thoughts in English. What was your favorite part of Clara and Eli's journey? We read every comment. Thanks again.